The day everything ended before it began. There is a moment, and I think most people who have ever been truly betrayed know exactly what I'm talking about, where time stops. Not in the beautiful way people describe when they talk about falling in love or holding their child for the first time. Not in any of those warm, golden ways. I mean the kind of stop where everything you believed, everything you built, everything you planned, every quiet hope you carried in the center of your chest, it all just shatters. Quietly. Without warning. Without even the dignity of a loud crash. My moment came on what should have been the happiest day of my life. It was a Saturday in October. The trees outside the church were gold and red. The air smelled like autumn and candle wax and expensive flowers. 200 guests were seated in white draped chairs. My dress was hanging in the bridal room. My bridesmaids were laughing, fixing their hair, taking pictures. And I was standing in a hallway, still in my robe, still in my slippers, holding a phone that had just shown me something I was never supposed to see. A message. One single message that unraveled 4 years of my life in 11 words. Tonight we tell her everything. Tonight we stop pretending. The message was from my maid of honor, to my fiancé. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because I had to sit with it. Alone, in a church hallway, with an orchestra warming up 30 feet away, and a priest arranging his notes at the altar, while my entire world quietly fell apart around me. What I did next? People said I was crazy. My mother cried. His family was furious. The guests were confused. The pastor didn't know where to look. But looking back now, standing on the other side of everything that came after, I know that what I did in that hallway was the first truly brave thing I had ever done in my adult life. This is my story. And it doesn't end in that church. It ends in a courtroom. How we became us. To understand what happened that October morning, you need to understand how Daniel and I got here. We met at 24. I was working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. He was a civil engineer, 3 years older than me, quiet but confident in that way that makes you feel like if he said something, he meant it. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to fill every silence. He listened. And back then, I thought that was rare. Our first date was an accident, honestly. We were both waiting for the same table at a restaurant on a rainy Thursday night. The hostess asked if we'd be willing to share. He said yes before I could say no. And for 2.5 hours, we talked like people who had been waiting their whole lives to have that conversation. He walked me to my car. He didn't ask for my number. He said, "I think you'll give it to me when you're ready." And then he walked away in the rain without looking back. I texted him before I even got home. For the next 4 years, Daniel was my person. That word people use, person, I used to roll my eyes at it. But that's what he was. When I had a bad day at work, he was the first call I made. When my dad got sick in year 2 of our relationship, Daniel drove 4 hours to sit in a hospital waiting room with me, without me even asking him to. When I had doubts about my career, he sat with me at the kitchen table at midnight and helped me think through every option until I felt steady again. He proposed on a Wednesday evening at home. No restaurant, no grand gesture. He cooked dinner, badly I should say, the man cannot cook. And afterward he just looked at me across the table and said, "I don't want to do any of this with anyone else." And then he put a ring on the table between us. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Now Mara. I need to tell you about Mara. Mara and I had been friends since college. 11 years. She was in every major chapter of my life. My graduation, my first apartment, my father's illness, my engagement. She was the first person I called when Daniel proposed. She cried. I cried. We cried together on the phone for 20 minutes. She was my maid of honor before I even asked her. It was just understood. Mara was sharp, funny, and effortlessly beautiful in that way that made rooms shift slightly when she walked in. She was also the kind of friend who made you feel chosen. Like out of everyone she could have given her time to, she picked you. That feeling is intoxicating when you're young, and still figuring out who you are. I never questioned it. Not once in 11 years did I question Mara. That was my first mistake, the things I didn't let myself see. I want to be honest with you, because this story only matters if I'm honest. Looking back, there were signs. There are always signs. About 6 months before the wedding, I noticed that Daniel and Mara had started texting more frequently. I know this because Daniel's phone would light up during dinner sometimes, and he'd glance at it and put it face down. He had never done that before. Daniel was the least secretive person I knew. He used to hand me his phone without hesitation, not because he had nothing to hide, but because the idea of hiding something from me simply never occurred to him. Or so I thought. I noticed that when Mara came over to help with wedding planning, she and Daniel would occasionally exchange these small, private looks. A glance that lasted half a second too long. A look that said something neither of them was saying out loud. I saw it twice, maybe 3 times. And each time, I filed it away in a folder in my mind labeled, "You're imagining things," and moved on. I told myself I was stressed. I told myself wedding planning brought out paranoia in brides. I told myself that Daniel and Mara had been friendly for 4 years, and of course they were comfortable with each other. There was one evening, about 2 months before the wedding. Mara had come over to help me address invitation envelopes, which, by the way, no one warns you about. 300 envelopes by hand is its own kind of punishment. Daniel was supposed to be at a late work meeting. Around 9 o'clock, Mara got a text. She read it, turned her phone over, and said she needed to leave a little early. 20 minutes after she left, Daniel came home. I asked how his meeting was. He said it ran long. He kissed me on the forehead and went to change his clothes. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by 300 envelopes, addressed to people who were about to watch us get married. I didn't let myself think the thought I was already thinking. I pushed it down, sealed it in something dark inside me, and went back to addressing envelopes. That folder in my mind, "You're imagining things." I kept adding to it, kept closing it, kept walking away. Until the morning of my wedding, when that folder finally split open on its own. What I read in a church hallway. The morning of the wedding was chaos in the beautiful way you dream about. 7 women getting ready in one room. Champagne at 10 in the morning. My mother crying while doing my hair, and then insisting she wasn't crying. My bridesmaids dancing to songs from our college years. The photographer moving around us like a quiet shadow, capturing everything. Mara was radiant. She wore her bridesmaid dress like it was designed specifically for her body. She was laughing, leading the energy of the room, making everyone feel loose and happy and excited. She kept touching my arm and saying things like, "You look perfect," and "He's so lucky," and "Today is going to be everything." At about 11:30, I stepped out of the bridal room to use the bathroom down the hall. My phone was in my robe pocket because my mother had asked me to bring a specific song to play while we did the final touches on my veil. In the hallway, I unlocked my phone, and there it was. I want to explain how this happened because it matters. Daniel and I used to share an iPad at home for streaming shows together. At some point, a year or so earlier, he'd been logged into his messages on that iPad, and those messages had briefly synced to my iCloud before he logged out. He must not have realized that one single thread, had stayed cached on my phone. Buried. Invisible unless you went looking in exactly the right place. I wasn't looking. I never looked. But when I unlocked my phone and opened the messaging app to find that song, I hit the wrong icon. And instead of my music, I opened an old iCloud message thread I hadn't seen before. The name at the top was Mara. And the last message in the thread, sent the previous night at 11:53 p.m., read, "Tonight we tell her everything. Tonight we stop pretending." I read it 3 times. My hands were completely steady. That's the strange thing. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. I felt a cold, clear, crystalline calm settle over me like water closing over the surface of a lake. I scrolled up. I want to spare you every detail of what I read, but I will tell you what I needed to know. I will tell you the shape of it. Daniel and Mara had been involved, romantically, emotionally, in every way, for over a year. It had started during a week when I was out of town for a work conference. It had continued in the spaces I had been too trusting to look into. Their messages were not the messages of two people in a fleeting moment of weakness. They were the messages of two people who had built something, who had made plans, who had talked at length about what came next. What came next, according to those messages, was supposed to be telling me the truth. After the wedding was called off, after everything fell apart, they had planned to tell me together. They had scheduled the conversation like an appointment. And then, at some point, that plan shifted. Because somewhere in those messages there was a different conversation, a colder one, where the decision changed, where they decided to wait, to let the wedding happen, to deal with it later, to let me get married and figure it out afterward. I stood in that hallway for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I could hear the orchestra warming up, and I counted the notes without meaning to. My mind was working in a way it never had before. Fast and cold and precise, like a machine that had just been switched on for the first time. I did not cry. I did not go back to the bridal room. I walked to the room where Daniel was getting ready, and I knocked on the door. What happens when you already know the answer? He opened the door already dressed. Navy suit, white shirt, the tie I had helped him pick out 3 weeks earlier at a department store on a Sunday afternoon while we were laughing about something I couldn't even remember now. He looked at me with the face of a man who thought he was about to get a beautiful moment. Bride appearing unexpectedly, breaking tradition, one of those wedding stories people tell later. He started to smile. Then he saw my face. "We need to talk," I said. "Now." He let me in. His groomsmen were down the hall. The room was quiet. He stood near the window, and I stood near the door, and I held out my phone. He looked at the screen, and I watched the smile disappear. I watched 4 years of practiced composure fall off his face like plaster from an old wall. And what was underneath was not guilt, at least not at first. What was underneath was calculation. I could see him working through it, trying to figure out how bad this was, how much I had read, what version of this he could still manage. "Claire," he started. "Don't," I said. "Please don't start with my name like that. I've read enough." He sat down on the edge of a chair. He put his hands on his knees. And then he did something that even now I find difficult to describe. He looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine anguish, real human pain, and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened. I'm so sorry." And here's the thing about that moment. Here's the thing that took me a long time to process. Part of me, some exhausted, grief-soaked part of me that had loved this man for 4 years, believed him, believed the apology, felt the pull of it. Because he wasn't wrong that he was sorry. He was sorry, just not in the way I needed him to be. He was sorry he got caught. He was sorry the timing was what it was. He was sorry for the inconvenience of it. But he was not sorry for the choice. Not genuinely. Not in the way a person is sorry when they know they were wrong from the beginning. I could feel the difference. I had never been able to feel that difference before, but I felt it then with absolute clarity. "Where is Mara?" I said. He closed his eyes. "Where is she, Daniel?" "She's here," he said quietly. "She came. She's in the building." Of course she was. She was my maid of honor. She was supposed to walk beside me down the aisle. I thought about everything I wanted to say in that moment. Every word that had been building in me since I read that first message in the hallway. Every version of hurt and fury and grief that was sitting right there, ready, waiting to come out. I chose not to use any of it. Because I had already decided, somewhere between that hallway and this door, that I was not going to fall apart in a church. I was not going to give this moment, this terrible stolen morning, the satisfaction of my tears. I looked at Daniel for a long time. I looked at him the way you look at something you are committing to memory because you know you will never see it the same way again. Then I said, "I need an hour." He blinked. "What?" "I need an hour. Don't come out of this room. Don't talk to anyone. Don't call Mara. Give me 1 hour." He started to say something. I didn't wait to hear it. I walked out of that room and pulled the door closed behind me and stood in the hallway, alone, with 200 guests in the church on the other side of the wall. And I made 3 phone calls. What happens in the spaces between decisions? The first call was to my brother. Marcus was 40 minutes away. I told him what I had found. I told him in the same flat, steady voice I'd used with Daniel, because that voice was all I had left and I didn't want to lose it. He didn't say much at first. He just said, "I'm coming." I told him to come to the side entrance and not to talk to anyone. He said, "Okay." And then, just before he hung up, he said, "Claire, you're going to be okay." It was such a simple thing, such a plain, ordinary sentence. But something about hearing my brother say those words in that moment held me together when I was very close to coming completely undone. The second call was to my lawyer, Patricia. I had kept her number from my father's estate proceedings 6 months earlier. She answered on the third ring. I told her only what was necessary, that I had discovered something the morning of my wedding, that financial arrangements had been made between Daniel and me over the past year, and that I needed to understand my options. She didn't ask me to explain more than that. She said, "Are you somewhere private?" I said yes. She said, "Take photographs of everything you've seen before you do anything else. Don't delete it, don't forward it. Just photograph the screen with a second device if you have one." I didn't have a second device, but one of the church's event coordinators was 3 doors down. I knocked on her door and asked to borrow her personal phone for 2 minutes. She looked confused but handed it over without question. I photographed every screen I needed. I returned her phone, thanked her, and went back to my own call. Patricia said, "Call me Monday morning. We'll talk through everything." I said okay, and the steadiness in her voice, that same flat professional calm she always had, anchored something in me. The third call was the one I had not planned to make. I called Mara. She answered on the first ring, bright, warm, unsuspecting. "Claire, are you okay? Is everything all right? Do you need me?" I said, "I need you to come to the east hallway. Just you. Don't bring anyone." There was a pause, just a half second, long enough to mean something. Then she said, "I'll be right there." She came around the corner 2 minutes later, still in her bridesmaid dress, holding her small bouquet. And when she saw my face, she stopped walking. She stopped completely, 3 feet away from me, and the color drained from her in a way I had only ever seen happen to people who had been caught. Not surprised, not confused, caught. She already knew why I had called her here. I could see that she knew. And the fact that she knew, the fact that she walked around that corner already knowing, told me something important. It told me that Mara had been preparing for this moment, had imagined it, had rehearsed some version of it in her own mind. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I held up my phone so she could see the thread, and I watched her face go through every stage of a person who has run out of road. "Claire," she started. "Don't," I said, for the second time that morning. And then I said the only thing I had planned to say to her. The thing I had composed in my mind during those 4 minutes in the hallway. "I want you to understand something. I am not going to fall apart in front of you. I'm not going to give you that. Because here is what I know about you, Mara. You need people to need you. You have always needed to be needed. And the moment I fall apart in front of you, you will find a way to be the person who puts me back together. And I refuse to let you have that." She started to cry. I turned and walked away. What I told 200 people. Marcus arrived 19 minutes later. By that point, I had changed out of my robe and put on the simple dress I had brought as a backup outfit for the rehearsal dinner. It was navy blue, plain, nothing like a wedding dress. I had taken off the jewelry. I had wiped my face clean and pulled my hair back simply. When Marcus came through the side door and saw me standing there in that plain navy dress, carrying my shoes in one hand and my phone in the other, his face did something complicated. He opened his arms and I walked into them and let myself stand there for exactly 30 seconds. Not crying, just breathing, just being held by someone I trusted completely. Then I stepped back and said, "I need to go into the church." He said, "What are you going to say?" I said the truth. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded. We walked through the side door and into the main hall of the church together. 200 people turned to look at us, and the confusion on their faces was immediate because I was not in a dress, and I was not walking down an aisle, and there was no music, and the expression on my face was not the expression of a bride. I walked to the front of the church. The priest stepped aside without a word. I stood at the altar, alone, in my navy backup dress, in front of everyone who had come to celebrate the beginning of my life with Daniel. And I said, into the complete silence of 200 people holding their breath, "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you have traveled a long way, and I am genuinely grateful for that. I need to tell you that the wedding is not going to happen today. I made this decision this morning, and it is the right decision, and I am not going to explain all of it here because some of it is private and some of it is not mine alone to tell. What I will tell you is this: I am okay. I am standing here in front of you because I refuse to let this morning define me by what I lost. I am choosing right now in front of all of you to let it define me by what I found. Thank you for your love and your presence. Please take the flowers. Please take the food. The catering has been paid for, and there is no reason for a beautiful meal to go to waste. I ask only that you give me some privacy today." I heard my mother make a sound somewhere in the middle of those rows. I heard Daniel's mother say something sharp and angry to someone beside her. I heard somewhere in the back a few people begin to cry. But mostly what I heard was silence. The wide, respectful silence of 200 people choosing to honor something they did not fully understand but could feel the weight of. I stepped down from the altar. Marcus took my arm, and we walked out of the church together. The quiet before the storm. The weeks that followed were the hardest I had ever lived through. I want to be honest about that too, because I think sometimes people tell stories like this, and they make the protagonist sound invincible from the moment of discovery, like the pain evaporates once you make a brave decision and walk away. That is not how grief works. That is not how betrayal works. The brave decision doesn't remove the loss. It just means you face it standing up instead of on your knees. I moved back to my childhood home for the first 2 weeks. My mother, who had been devastated and confused and furious all at once, quietly made up my old room, put fresh flowers on the nightstand, and said nothing except, "Eat something." It was the right instinct. Sometimes love doesn't require words. Sometimes it just requires someone putting flowers on your nightstand without explanation. I did not answer most calls. I answered Marcus. I answered Patricia. I answered my closest colleague at work, a woman named Sue Yan, who sent me a message on the third day that said simply, "Whenever you're ready, your job is here, and so am I." Nothing more. No questions. No advice. I have never forgotten that message. Daniel tried to reach me 7 times in the first week. I did not respond. On the 8th attempt, I sent one message back. It said, "All further contact needs to go through Patricia. Her number is below." He called her that same afternoon. Mara went completely silent. She did not call. She did not write. Not one word in those first weeks. Part of me had expected her to fight, to explain, to apologize, to appear on my doorstep with some version of the story that would try to make sense of 11 years and what she had done to them. But she didn't. She disappeared. And the silence from her was, in some ways, harder than anything Daniel had done. Because Daniel had been a partner. Mara had been a friend. And the particular emptiness of losing a friendship that long, a friendship that had lived in you that deeply, is its own specific kind of grief that no one really prepares you for. I gave myself 2 weeks to feel all of it. I cried. I slept 12 hours some nights and 3 hours on others. I ate badly, and then ate well, and then forgot to eat entirely. I walked around my parents' neighborhood at 6 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, and I let myself feel every single thing I was feeling without filtering it or managing it or trying to be brave about it. And then on the 15th day, I called Patricia, and I said, "Tell me what we can do." What Patricia found. Here is where the story turns. Because when I sat down with Patricia on that Monday morning and began laying out the financial picture of my relationship with Daniel, something happened that neither of us had expected. Let me explain the background. Daniel and I had been engaged for 14 months. During that time, we had made several shared financial decisions that were completely normal for a couple planning a life together. We had opened a joint savings account, a wedding fund, to which we had each contributed equally every month. We had co-signed a lease on an apartment we were planning to move into after the honeymoon. And 6 months before the wedding, at Daniel's suggestion, I had added his name to a savings account my father had left me. A modest inheritance, around $42,000, that I had kept untouched since my father passed. I want you to understand my reasoning on that last point. Daniel had suggested it as a practical measure. We were getting married. We were combining our finances. He said it made sense for both our names to be on all significant accounts going forward. He said it was about building something together. And I, trusting him completely, loving him completely, had agreed without hesitation. Patricia listened to all of this. She wrote things down. And then she asked me one question. She said, "When did Daniel add his name to your father's account?" I said, "About 6 months before the wedding, maybe late April." She nodded. She made a note. She said, "And when did the relationship with Mara begin, based on the messages you read?" I thought back. Based on what I had read, it appeared to have started around 14 months before the wedding, give or take. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "So he was already involved with Mara when he suggested adding his name to your father's inheritance account." The room went very quiet. I said, "Yes, I believe so." She said, "Claire, I need you to pull the statements for that account going back 12 months. I did. She reviewed them that same day and called me that evening. Her voice was careful and controlled, the voice of someone choosing their words with precision. She said, "There have been 4 withdrawals from your father's account over the past 11 months. Each one was made by Daniel. Combined, they totaled just under $28,000. I did not say anything for a moment. She continued, "None of these withdrawals were discussed with you?" "No." "None of them were for joint expenses you agreed on together?" "No." "And the wedding fund joint account? When I pull those statements, what am I likely to find?" I already knew what she was going to find. I could feel it before she said it. "Pull them," I said. She called me the next morning. Over the course of 8 months, Daniel had made a series of transfers out of our joint wedding fund. Some were small, a few $100s here and there, spread out, timed in a way that was clearly designed not to attract attention. Some were larger. The total, when Patricia added it up, was just over $31,000. $31,000 from the wedding fund, $28,000 from my father's inheritance, $59,000, quietly, methodically, over the course of nearly a year, while planning a wedding he may never have intended to go through with. Patricia said, "I need you to think very carefully before we take the next step, because once we file, this becomes public record." I said, "Patricia, file everything." Learning a different kind of patience. I want to be honest about something. I am not a person who naturally gravitates toward legal processes. I am an accountant. I work in numbers and systems. But the law moves in its own rhythm, and that rhythm is slow. And when you are sitting on the other side of a betrayal, this deep slow feels like torture. Patricia was methodical. She filed a civil claim for financial recovery, the combined $59,000 plus applicable damages, based on fraudulent access and unauthorized withdrawal from accounts held in my name, or jointly under circumstances, she argued, were obtained through misrepresentation. In other words, the argument was this: Daniel had gained access to my father's account by presenting himself as a future husband, a permanent life partner, someone whose access to those funds was appropriate. The relationship he used to justify that access was, Patricia argued, fundamentally misrepresented, because at the time he requested to be added to that account, he was already engaged in a deliberate, concealed relationship with another person. It was not a simple argument. Patricia told me that plainly. She said, "We are going to have to prove intent. We are going to have to show that the financial access was obtained under false pretenses. That is going to require the messages. It is going to require a timeline, and it is going to require you to sit across from Daniel in a courtroom and let the record speak." I said I understood. She said, "It may also require Mara's involvement, depending on how his defense chooses to respond." I said I understood that too. What I did not fully anticipate was the counterfiling. 3 weeks after Patricia submitted our claim, Daniel's attorney filed a response. And attached to that response was a counterclaim asserting that I had caused him significant reputational and professional harm by publicly canceling our wedding without cause, without his consent, and without giving him the opportunity to respond. He was claiming damages. He was claiming that my statement in the church, my calm, measured, dignified statement that had named no one and explained nothing, had constituted some form of public defamation. When Patricia read me that counterclaim over the phone, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I put the tea down. I took a slow breath, and I said, "How do we respond to that?" Patricia said, without a pause, "We respond with evidence. The one variable nobody planned for." Here is the thing about Mara that Daniel had not accounted for. Mara was brilliant. She was strategic and self-aware, and she had always known exactly what she was doing at every step of her life. What Daniel perhaps did not understand, or perhaps underestimated, was that those same qualities applied to what happened when Mara felt cornered. When Daniel's attorney filed that counterclaim, something shifted. Because the counterclaim, by its very existence, did something Daniel had not intended. It dragged Mara into the legal record. Patricia had been careful in our original filing to reference the messages between Daniel and Mara only in the context of establishing the timeline of financial misrepresentation. But Daniel's counterclaim, in trying to argue that I had acted without cause, forced his attorney to question the validity of my reasons for canceling the wedding. Which meant, in order to defend our position, Patricia now had grounds to introduce the full content of those messages, which meant Mara's name was now formally part of the case. Mara hired her own attorney within a week of that development. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning about 2 months into the process, Patricia called me with something unexpected in her voice. Something that, for Patricia, was almost close to surprise. She said, "Mara's attorney reached out. She wants to cooperate." I sat very still. Patricia said, "She is willing to provide a formal statement corroborating the timeline. She is willing to confirm the dates, the nature of the relationship, and, this is the significant part, she is willing to state, formally and on record, that the relationship with Daniel began before he requested to be added to your father's account." I said, "Why?" Patricia paused. Then she said, "Her attorney says she came to them voluntarily, that she felt the counterclaim crossed a line, specifically the claim that you acted without cause. She apparently told her attorney, and I'm reading from their message here, that she was not willing to sit quietly while you were characterized as the unreasonable party." I did not know how to feel about that. I still don't entirely. There is a version of me that wanted to dismiss it, to see it as strategy, as Mara protecting herself, as something calculated. And maybe some of it was. People's motivations are rarely clean, but there is another version that remembers 11 years, that remembers who Mara was before any of this. And that version understood, in some quiet corner, that what she was doing was the hardest right thing she could have managed. Not good enough to undo the damage. Not enough to rebuild what was lost. But real. And at that point in my life, anything real felt significant. I told Patricia, accept the cooperation. The day the record spoke. The hearing was on a Thursday in March, 5 months after the wedding that never happened. I wore a gray blazer and dark trousers. Patricia stood beside me at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Daniel sat with his attorney, a polished, impassive man named Garrett, who had clearly handled many cases exactly like this one and had learned not to let anything show on his face. Daniel looked different than he had the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, more careful in the way he held himself. He glanced at me when I walked in, and then looked away quickly, the way people look away from things that cost them something to see. Mara was in the corridor outside, waiting to give her statement. She and I had not spoken directly since that morning in the church hallway. We did not speak that day either. But as I passed her in the corridor on the way in, she looked at me, and I looked at her, and nothing was said. But something was acknowledged, something that neither of us needed words for. The proceedings were not dramatic in the way courtroom scenes in movies are dramatic. There was no shouting. There was no thunderous revelation. Legal proceedings rarely work that way. What they are, at their core, is a room where a record gets established, where documentation becomes truth, where the thing that was done in private becomes, permanently, public fact. Patricia laid out the financial timeline first. She walked the judge through every withdrawal, every transfer, every date. She was precise and unhurried. She presented the bank statements. She presented the messages from Daniel's thread with Mara, specifically the dates, cross-referenced against the date that Daniel's name was added to my father's account. The judge was a composed woman in her 60s who asked 3 questions during Patricia's presentation and wrote down the answers herself by hand. She did not perform any emotion. She simply received the information the way a person receives information when they intend to act on it correctly. Garrett's cross-examination tried several angles. He tried to argue that the financial transfers could be explained as contributions toward shared wedding expenses, that the withdrawals were legitimate and consensual. Patricia had anticipated this. She produced itemized vendor receipts for every wedding expense paid from both our accounts, documented, verifiable, complete. The transfers Daniel had made did not correspond to any vendor payment or shared expense on record. Then Garrett tried a different approach. He argued that the messages, however inappropriate in personal terms, did not constitute legal misrepresentation in a financial context. That emotional infidelity, however painful, was not the same as financial fraud. Patricia stood up for her rebuttal and said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "The question is not whether emotional infidelity is illegal. The question is whether the access to the plaintiff's inherited funds was obtained through a representation, specifically, the representation of an exclusive and committed relationship, that the defendant knew, at the time of making it, to be false. The evidence before this court establishes that at the time the defendant requested joint access to the plaintiff's father's account, presenting himself as her future and faithful husband, he was already engaged in a relationship that directly contradicted that representation. The financial access was granted on the basis of trust. That trust was, at the time of granting, already deliberately compromised. That is the claim." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the judge made a note. Mara gave her statement in a composed, steady voice. She confirmed the timeline. She confirmed when the relationship had begun. She confirmed the date. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She was precise and clear, and she did not look at Daniel while she spoke. When it was done, She walked back out through the doors, and I did not see her again that day. What the judge said. The judge did not rule from the bench that day. We were told to expect a written ruling within 3 weeks. It came in 17 days. I was at work when Patricia called. I stepped into an empty conference room and closed the door and stood at the window looking out at the city while she read me the summary. The counterclaim filed by Daniel's attorney was dismissed in its entirety. The judge found no basis for the defamation assertion, noting that my public statement at the church had named no individuals, made no specific accusations, and had been made under circumstances any reasonable person would consider deeply distressing. The claim that I had acted without cause was, in the judge's words, contradicted by the documentary evidence presented. On our claim, the judge found in our favor. Daniel was ordered to return the full amount withdrawn from my father's account, $27,800, plus a damages assessment of $4,000, citing the manner in which the access had been obtained. The wedding fund transfers were treated separately, as those had been a joint account. The judge ordered an equal split of the remaining balance and directed that the funds Daniel had transferred out be partially restored from his portion of that split. In total, the judgment came to just over $35,000 returned to me. Patricia said, "Are you okay?" I stood at the window for a moment. Outside, the city was going about its ordinary Thursday afternoon. People walking, traffic moving, everything proceeding at its normal pace, completely indifferent to the fact that something in me had just quietly completed a long circle. I said, "Yes, I think I am." She said, "It was the right call, Claire. Every step of it." I said, "Thank you, Patricia." And I meant it in a way that a simple thank you cannot fully hold. The after. People always want to know what happened to Daniel and Mara after. I understand the impulse. There is something in us that needs the full accounting, that needs to know whether the people who caused the harm paid a price beyond the legal one, whether life adjusted its scales in some visible way. I will tell you what I know, and I will be honest about the limits of what I know. Daniel lost his position at his engineering firm within a few months of the hearing. Not as a direct legal consequence. The civil case had no employment implications. But word travels in the way that word travels in a city that is smaller than it looks. Colleagues knew. The industry knew. Some of his professional relationships, built on the perception of a man of integrity, quietly shifted. He moved to another city about 8 months after the ruling. I don't know where. I didn't look. It wasn't information I needed. Mara and Daniel did not stay together. I learned this not from either of them, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it carefully, watching my face for a reaction, about a year after everything. Apparently, the relationship had not survived the weight of what it had cost. What it had required of each of them to sustain it, in secret and in conflict, had left something damaged that couldn't be repaired once the secret was gone. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard this. I want to be honest about that. By then, I was far enough from it that I mostly felt tired. The distant, worn-out tiredness of someone who has processed something large and set it down. Mara reached out to me once, about 14 months after the hearing. A letter, handwritten, several pages long. I will not share the contents here because they belong to her and to whatever she is working through. I read it once, then put it away in a drawer. I have not responded. I may not. The door is not closed the way anger slams a door. It is simply not open yet. Whether it opens someday, I genuinely don't know. Some things need more time than others. Some friendships can be rebuilt from the rubble, and some cannot. I haven't decided yet what this one is. What I know is that the decision is mine to make. For the first time in a long time, the decision is entirely mine. The woman in the navy dress. I think about her sometimes. The woman in the navy backup dress, standing at the altar in front of 200 people. She terrified me a little, honestly. I had never been that person before. I had spent most of my adult life being careful, measured, considered, working within structures, trusting the people closest to me in a way that I now understand was sometimes more about avoiding conflict than about genuine trust. That woman in the navy dress was different. She had just had her world end, and she had chosen, in the middle of it, not to collapse and not to perform, not to cry publicly for sympathy, and not to disappear quietly to protect anyone's feelings. She had simply stood in the wreckage and told the truth as much as she could tell it, and then she had walked out, and then she had sat in her childhood bedroom for 2 weeks and let herself grieve, and then she had called a lawyer and begun rebuilding. She did not do it perfectly. She made mistakes in the months that followed. She had days when the grief came back hard and unexpected, when she would be in the middle of a completely ordinary task, and suddenly the loss would hit her again with all of its original weight, as if no time had passed at all. She had moments of doubt and anger and bitterness that she had to actively choose not to live in. But she kept choosing. Every day, some version of choosing the harder, cleaner path over the easier, darker one. That is what I am most proud of. Not the courtroom, not the verdict, not the money recovered, though that mattered. What I am most proud of is the choosing. The daily, imperfect, unglamorous act of choosing to keep going in the right direction, even when it would have been easier to stop. I am 30 now. I left the accounting firm and started my own small financial consulting practice 18 months ago. It is not large. It is not impressive by most measures. But every piece of it is mine, built with my own decisions, accountable to no one's choices but my own. I have 2 people working with me now, and we are adding a third in the spring. I have a small apartment with a kitchen table I bought secondhand and refinished myself. I have a collection of plants that I am moderately skilled at keeping alive. I have friendships, different ones than before, deeper in some ways, more honestly earned. I have mornings when I wake up and feel simply and straightforwardly okay, which I did not realize I had been missing until it came back. I am not who I was before that October morning. I don't think you can go through something like that and come out the same person on the other side. But I am, I think, more genuinely myself than I have ever been. And that, the peculiar gift hidden inside the wreckage, that is something I could not have planned for and would not now give back. What this story is actually about. I have thought a long time about what this story is actually about. Because on the surface, it looks like a story about betrayal and revenge and a courtroom. And those things are all in it, yes. But I don't think that's the center of it. I think this story is about the moment you discover that the version of yourself you have been protecting is not, in fact, the truest version. That the careful, trusting, conflict-avoiding person you constructed over years of being a good partner and a good friend, that version of you was real, and she was good in many ways, but she was also, without realizing it, slowly disappearing. There is a particular kind of erosion that happens in relationships where you love someone more than you respect yourself, where you see things that trouble you and choose the explanation that requires the least disruption, where you file away the evidence in a folder labeled, "You're imagining things," because the alternative, trusting your own perception, confronting what you see, feels too costly. I had been doing that for years, not just with Daniel, with Mara too, perhaps even with myself. The morning in the church did not make me strong. I want to be clear about that. It revealed that I already was. It took away the comfortable illusions that had been covering something that had been there all along. That is what betrayal does, in its strangest and most terrible gift. It removes everything that was false. It strips the room down to the walls. And what you find underneath, the bones of who you actually are, you finally get to see clearly. Perhaps for the first time. The woman who stood at that altar was not performing bravery. She was simply done pretending. And from that place, that bare, stripped, honest place, everything that came after was possible. What I want you to take away. If you are somewhere in the middle of something like this, if you are the person reading this in a quiet moment, recognizing some part of your own story in mine, I want to say something to you directly. Trust what you see. I know that sounds simple. I know that in practice, it is one of the hardest things a human being can do, especially when what you see threatens something you have built and someone you love. The instinct to look away is powerful. The instinct to file things in the "you're imagining things" folder is almost overwhelming. I understand it. I lived in it for months. But the thing you keep choosing not to see has a cost. It costs you in small daily ways. A little bit of your clarity here, a little bit of your confidence there, a slow dimming of the part of you that trusts its own perception. And those costs compound, quietly. The way the withdrawals from my account compounded. Small, spread out, easy to miss until Patricia laid them all on the table at once. Trust what you see. And when the moment comes where you can no longer look away, when the folder finally opens on its own and the truth is simply there, unavoidable and clear, do not let your response to it be defined by what other people need you to feel. Do not perform grief for a crowd. Do not perform forgiveness before you feel it. Do not perform strength either, if what you need is to collapse quietly in a childhood bedroom for 2 weeks. Just be honest. With yourself first. With others as much as you can manage. The courtroom, the verdict, the money returned. Those things mattered. They were right and they were just, and I am glad they happened. But the truest justice in this story was not handed down by a judge. It was the moment in the hallway, before anyone else knew, when I stopped filing things away and let myself see clearly. That was the moment everything changed. That was where it really began.